Some secrets are impossible to keep hidden when even your wolf refuses to cooperate. Claire Morgan opened her eyes just before dawn, expecting to see the familiar wooden ceiling of her tiny bedroom above her. Instead, the first thing she noticed was the enormous black wolf peacefully curled across the middle of her bed, its thick tail hanging over the edge of the quilt she had carefully sewn herself only a month earlier. She blinked once, wondering if she was still dreaming. Then she looked toward the woven rug beside the fireplace and nearly forgot how to breathe. A tall man with dark hair was asleep on the floor, wrapped awkwardly in an extra blanket, as though he had chosen the hardest place in the room without a second thought. Even asleep, there was no mistaking the face. Alpha King Lucas Ashford rested against the stone hearth with one arm beneath his head, while the morning light slipped through the cabin window and settled across his peaceful expression. Claire quietly covered her mouth to stop herself from laughing out loud. Somehow, during the night, the kingdom's most respected Alpha King had surrendered his bed to his own wolf and ended up sleeping on her floor instead. The situation made absolutely no sense. Yet this was no longer the strangest morning she had experienced. To understand why the Alpha King had somehow found himself asleep beside her fireplace, while his enormous wolf occupied her bed as though it owned the place, it is necessary to return several days earlier, before anyone realized that destiny sometimes arrived on 4 paws instead of 2 feet. Claire lived alone in a cozy stone cottage on the edge of the royal forest, less than a mile from the palace gardens. She worked as one of the palace gardeners, tending rare flowers that decorated the castle throughout every season. Her days were wonderfully predictable. She watered climbing roses before sunrise, trimmed lavender beneath the eastern wall, and spent quiet afternoons nurturing herbs whose fragrance drifted gently through the winding garden paths. She preferred simple routines because simple routines rarely surprised anyone. Every evening, she returned home carrying a small basket filled with leftover bread, fresh vegetables, and occasionally a slice of apple pie gifted by the palace kitchen. Her cottage was modest, but it always felt warm. A small fireplace crackled through cool evenings, shelves overflowed with books about flowers and woodland plants, and a patchwork quilt covered the narrow bed tucked beside the window overlooking the forest. It was the kind of peaceful place where nothing unusual ever happened. Until one rainy night changed everything. Wind whispered through the trees while gentle rain tapped against the cottage roof. Claire had just finished reading beside the fire when she heard an unexpected scratching sound outside her front door. Assuming a stray dog had wandered in from the village seeking shelter, she grabbed a lantern, unlocked the door, and stepped onto the porch. Standing beneath the rain was the largest black wolf she had ever seen. Its thick fur glistened beneath the lantern light. Its silver eyes watched her carefully, and despite its impressive size, there was something strangely patient about the way it simply waited without making a sound. Claire should have been frightened. Instead, she found herself speaking the very first words that came into her mind. "You look like you could use a warm place to sleep tonight." The giant wolf slowly tilted its head as though it had understood every single word, and somewhere far beyond the trees, fate quietly smiled because neither Claire nor the Alpha King hidden behind those remarkable silver eyes had any idea that one simple act of kindness was about to change both of their lives forever. Claire Morgan stepped aside and held the cottage door open without the slightest hint of fear. The enormous black wolf studied her for another quiet moment before padding inside with surprising gentleness, carefully avoiding the small table near the entrance as though it understood the room better than she expected. Water dripped from its thick coat onto the wooden floor, leaving a trail of tiny puddles that reflected the warm glow of the fireplace. Claire closed the door against the rain and smiled to herself. "Well, you certainly picked the right night to visit." The wolf remained perfectly still beside the fire, watching her with intelligent silver eyes that seemed almost too thoughtful for an ordinary animal. Claire disappeared into the kitchen corner and returned carrying an old towel that she usually reserved for muddy gardening boots. Kneeling beside the wolf, she hesitated for only a heartbeat before gently drying the rainwater from its broad shoulders. To her surprise, the giant animal lowered its head slightly, making her task easier. "Thank you," she laughed softly. "You are much more polite than most people I know." The wolf blinked once, earning another smile from Claire. She soon realized the towel was far too small for such an enormous guest, so she fetched a thicker blanket and carefully rubbed the damp fur until it became soft and warm again. Once she finished, she placed an extra quilt beside the fireplace. "You can sleep there tonight," she said kindly. "My bed is not nearly big enough for someone your size." The wolf glanced toward the quilt, then toward Claire, and finally settled onto the blanket with a long, contented sigh that somehow made the little cottage feel even cozier than before. The following morning, Claire awoke to bright sunlight streaming through her window. She immediately looked toward the fireplace. The blanket remained neatly folded exactly where she had left it, but the giant wolf had disappeared without making a sound. She opened the front door and found enormous paw prints leading back toward the royal forest before fading into the morning grass. "Goodbye, mysterious visitor," she whispered with a small wave before leaving for work. At the palace gardens, life continued as usual. Claire spent the morning climbing roses while humming quietly to herself. Other gardeners chatted cheerfully about the approaching Harvest Moon Festival that would soon bring visitors from across the kingdom. Claire listened with half an ear, though her thoughts occasionally drifted back to the strange wolf. She wondered whether it had found shelter after leaving her cottage or whether it had returned to the deep forest where it belonged. Meanwhile, inside the royal palace, Lucas Ashford sat through a council meeting while attempting to ignore several puzzled glances from his advisors. One of them finally cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, you seem unusually well rested this morning." Lucas looked up from a stack of reports with genuine confusion. "Do I?" The advisor smiled. "You have not frowned once during the entire meeting." Lucas almost answered before pausing. Fragments of the previous night drifted through his memory. He remembered transforming into his wolf beneath the full moon as he often did to clear his thoughts after long days of royal duties. He remembered wandering through the forest. After that, everything became strangely blurred until he recalled waking near sunrise beneath unfamiliar wooden beams with the comforting scent of lavender lingering in the air. Before he could piece the memories together, another advisor interrupted with questions about festival preparations. Lucas forced himself to return his attention to the meeting, though one quiet thought refused to leave him. Somewhere beyond the palace walls stood a small cottage that somehow felt unexpectedly familiar. That evening, as the sun slowly disappeared behind the forest, Claire lit her fireplace once again, smiled at the empty quilt beside the hearth, and jokingly said aloud, "I wonder if my oversized guest plans to visit twice." She expected only silence in return. Instead, just as the first stars appeared overhead, 3 gentle scratches sounded once more against her front door. Claire smiled before opening the door, somehow already certain who she would find waiting on the other side. Sure enough, the enormous black wolf stood quietly beneath the cool evening sky with a few leaves resting on its broad back and a patient expression that almost seemed apologetic. "You actually came back," she whispered with delighted surprise. The wolf gave a slow blink, then stepped into the cottage without hesitation as though it had memorized the path after only one visit. This time Claire had already prepared an extra blanket beside the fireplace and placed a large bowl of fresh water nearby. The giant animal examined both with obvious approval before settling comfortably onto the woven rug. "You learn quickly," Claire laughed while hanging her gardening apron near the door. "Or perhaps you simply have excellent manners." The wolf watched her move around the cottage while she prepared a simple dinner of vegetable soup, warm bread, and baked apples sprinkled with cinnamon. Every so often she glanced toward her unusual guest, expecting it to grow restless or anxious inside such a small home. Instead, the wolf seemed completely content simply listening to the crackling fire and observing her quiet evening routine. At one point, Claire carried her favorite rocking chair closer to the fireplace and opened another gardening book. "I hope you do not mind if I read for a while," she said. "You are welcome to stay as long as you like." The wolf lowered its head onto its front paws and closed its eyes, though one ear continued turning toward the sound of her voice every time she read a sentence aloud. Hours slipped by peacefully until Claire noticed the fire beginning to fade. She stood, placed another log into the fireplace, and noticed the temperature inside the cottage had grown noticeably cooler. Without thinking twice, she picked up the thick wool blanket resting across the back of her chair and gently draped it over the wolf's shoulders. "There," she said warmly. Even impressive visitors should stay comfortable. The wolf opened its silver eyes with unmistakable surprise before letting out a deep, satisfied breath that sounded almost grateful. Far away inside the royal palace, Lucas suddenly awakened in his own bed long before sunrise. He sat upright in confusion, sensing the lingering warmth of a blanket around his shoulders, even though none had been there when he fell asleep. His steward entered moments later carrying the morning schedule. "Good morning, Your Majesty." Lucas frowned thoughtfully. "Tell me something honestly. Has my wolf been wandering again?" The steward hesitated carefully. "Your Majesty, the palace guards reported that your wolf disappeared shortly after sunset yesterday. They searched the eastern forest until midnight, but found nothing unusual." Lucas quietly rubbed his forehead. The fragmented memories had become clearer. He remembered soft firelight, the scent of cinnamon, and a gentle voice reading from a gardening book while someone carefully covered him with a blanket. None of it made sense. Every instinct told him he should investigate immediately, yet another part of him strangely hoped the memories were real. Later that afternoon, while inspecting preparations for the Harvest Moon Festival, Lucas unexpectedly spotted Claire working among rows of white roses near the palace fountain. She was carefully tying delicate stems to wooden supports while humming the same melody he vaguely remembered hearing beside the fireplace. Without realizing it, Lucas stopped walking. Claire looked up, noticed the Alpha King watching from across the garden, and immediately offered a respectful bow before returning to her flowers. Lucas politely nodded in return, yet an unfamiliar feeling lingered long after he continued on his way. That evening Claire returned home beneath a sky painted gold and violet. She had barely finished placing fresh lavender into a vase beside her window when 3 familiar scratches echoed softly against her front door once again, sounding less like the arrival of a wild creature and more like the gentle knock of an old friend who already knew he would always be welcomed inside. The familiar scratching had barely faded before Claire reached the door with an amused smile already forming on her face. "You really do keep your own schedule," she said as she welcomed the giant black wolf inside once again. The animal shook a few raindrops from its thick coat, carefully avoiding the shelves filled with flower pots before walking directly toward the fireplace like it had done dozens of times instead of only a few. Claire laughed quietly. "Now you are acting as though this is your cottage." The wolf looked back at her with calm silver eyes that somehow made the teasing remark feel completely true. Over the next several evenings, the unusual routine settled naturally into both of their lives. Claire would finish tending the palace gardens before sunset, carry home a basket of fresh bread and herbs, light the fire, and prepare enough warm soup for herself while placing a second bowl of water beside the hearth without even thinking about it. Almost every night, shortly after the stars appeared above the forest, 3 gentle scratches announced the arrival of her mysterious guest. The wolf never demanded attention, never made a mess, and never frightened her. Instead, it quietly watched her read books, listened while she spoke about stubborn roses that refused to bloom, and occasionally rested its enormous head beside her rocking chair until she absent-mindedly scratched behind one ear. It soon became difficult for Claire to imagine the cottage without those peaceful evenings. Meanwhile, Lucas Ashford found himself waking every morning with increasingly vivid memories that clearly did not belong to dreams. He remembered the comforting scent of lavender drying above a fireplace, the warmth of a handmade quilt carefully tucked over his shoulders, and the gentle sound of Claire thanking the flowers for another successful day before she watered them. None of those details should have existed inside his mind unless his wolf had truly experienced them. Determined to prove that he remained completely in control, Lucas ordered the palace staff to prepare a different bedroom on the opposite side of the castle. The royal physician suggested calming herbal tea before sleep. His captain of the guard doubled the night patrol around the palace grounds. Lucas even locked the balcony doors himself before going to bed. "Perhaps this will finally end the wandering," he quietly told himself. The following morning, he opened his eyes expecting to see the elegant ceiling of his new royal chamber. Instead, he found himself wrapped in Claire's familiar patchwork quilt while lying comfortably on the woven rug beside her fireplace. His wolf was peacefully stretched across her narrow bed, occupying nearly every inch of it, while Claire remained asleep in a cushioned chair with an open gardening book resting across her lap. Lucas stared at the unbelievable scene in complete disbelief. Somehow his wolf had ignored every precaution, carried him halfway across the kingdom after transforming back during the night, and once again surrendered the bed to itself while leaving the Alpha King sleeping on the floor. Before Claire could wake, Lucas quietly gathered the folded blanket around his shoulders, slipped outside into the cool morning air, and hurried toward the forest with equal parts embarrassment and confusion. Later that afternoon, during a meeting about the upcoming Harvest Moon Festival, Lucas struggled to focus on maps and schedules because every logical explanation continued slipping away from him. His advisors discussed decorations, musicians, and visiting noble families, but Lucas could only think about one impossible question. If this truly was nothing more than instinct, then why did every memory his wolf brought back feel less like an animal seeking shelter and more like a man discovering the only place where his heart had finally learned how to rest? Lucas Ashford refused to surrender to a mystery he could not explain. The following evening, instead of returning to his royal chamber after dinner, he ordered a temporary office prepared inside the western watchtower overlooking the palace walls. Only his captain knew where he intended to spend the night, and even then Lucas offered no explanation beyond saying that he wished to review festival security in complete privacy. As midnight approached, he remained awake beside a lantern with maps spread across the table, determined to prove that his wolf could not possibly wander if he never allowed himself to fall into a deep sleep. For hours, everything remained perfectly ordinary. The palace stood quiet beneath a blanket of stars while distant guards exchanged routine greetings across the walls. Lucas read reports, signed documents, and occasionally looked toward the forest where Claire's small cottage rested somewhere beyond the trees. He reminded himself that she was simply one of many loyal citizens serving the kingdom. There was no reason for his thoughts to return to her gentle smile, her cozy fireplace, or the peaceful evenings his wolf seemed determined to remember. Eventually, exhaustion overcame even the strongest resolve. His eyes closed for only a moment. When morning sunlight warmed his face, Lucas immediately realized something had gone terribly wrong. The scent of lavender drifted through the air. Birds sang outside a familiar window. He slowly opened his eyes and found himself sitting upright in Claire's rocking chair with a folded blanket carefully tucked around him. Across the room, the giant black wolf occupied nearly the entire bed once again, sleeping soundly with its head resting on Claire's patchwork quilt. Claire herself stood quietly in the tiny kitchen stirring oatmeal while humming the same cheerful melody she always sang before sunrise. She turned, noticed Lucas awake, and froze for one surprised heartbeat before offering an understanding smile instead of panic. "Good morning, Your Majesty," she said gently. Lucas immediately stood, his face warmer than the fire burning beside them. "I sincerely apologize. I do not know how this keeps happening." Claire glanced toward the sleeping wolf before looking back at him with kind eyes. "It seems your wolf has decided that my cottage is the safest place in the kingdom." Lucas sighed with obvious embarrassment. "I have tried everything to stop this." Claire poured a cup of warm herbal tea and placed it into his hands. "Sometimes trying harder is not the same as understanding why something happens." Her words lingered in the quiet room longer than either of them expected. Lucas accepted the tea with grateful hesitation, noticing once again how naturally she treated him, not as a king, but simply as someone who seemed to need a warm drink after an unusually confusing morning. Before leaving, he carefully folded the blanket she had loaned him and placed it neatly on the chair. "Thank you for your patience," he said sincerely. Claire smiled. "You are always polite, whether you arrive on 2 feet or 4. The unexpected joke drew an honest laugh from Lucas, the first carefree laugh he had enjoyed in many weeks. As he walked back through the forest toward the palace, that quiet laughter echoed inside his thoughts far longer than it should have. Later that afternoon, while inspecting preparations for the Harvest Moon Festival, Lucas found himself watching Claire from a respectful distance as she carefully arranged white lilies along the palace courtyard. She moved with the same quiet kindness she showed every flower, every visitor, and even one impossible wolf that refused to stay away. For the first time, Lucas stopped blaming instinct alone. Somewhere deep inside his heart, another possibility had begun to take root, one that no amount of discipline or distance seemed capable of denying. The days leading to the Harvest Moon Festival filled the kingdom with cheerful anticipation. Yet Lucas Ashford found himself carrying a quiet uncertainty that no royal duty could distract him from. Every logical explanation he had trusted throughout his life continued slipping away whenever his thoughts returned to Claire Morgan and the little stone cottage waiting beyond the forest. If his wolf truly acted on instinct alone, why did every memory it brought back feel filled with comfort instead of impulse, with peace instead of confusion? Hoping that distance might finally silence the questions growing inside his heart, Lucas announced that he would spend the next several days inspecting the northern border villages before the festival began. The journey would keep him nearly 50 miles from the capital, farther away than his wolf had ever wandered before. His advisors welcomed the decision, believing the inspection would reassure nearby communities before thousands of visitors arrived for the celebration. Lucas quietly hoped it would also reassure himself. Meanwhile, Claire noticed the palace felt strangely different. Gardeners whispered that the Alpha King had left the capital on official business, and although she simply nodded and continued tending rows of lilies and climbing roses, she was surprised by the small feeling of disappointment that settled inside her chest. That evening she returned to her cottage carrying fresh herbs, lit the fireplace, and automatically placed the familiar bowl of water beside the hearth before stopping herself with a gentle smile. Old habits appear quickly, she murmured while looking toward the empty space where the giant wolf usually rested. She spent the evening reading beside the fire, expecting only silence outside. Yet just after midnight, 3 soft scratches echoed against her front door. Claire looked up in complete disbelief before hurrying across the room. When she opened the door, the enormous black wolf stood patiently beneath a sky filled with bright stars, breathing calmly after what must have been an incredibly long journey. Tiny pieces of dry grass clung to its thick fur, and a few burrs had tangled near one shoulder, quietly revealing the distance it had traveled. Claire could not help smiling with relief. "You found your way back again." The wolf stepped inside without hesitation and lowered its head, while Claire carefully removed the tangled burrs from its coat one by one. "You really should avoid running through fields like that," she teased gently. The wolf remained perfectly still, watching her with grateful silver eyes as though every moment inside the warm cottage was worth the exhausting trip. Far away, just before dawn, Lucas awakened inside a guest room in the northern village where he had fallen asleep the previous evening. The village mayor stared at him with obvious confusion. "Your Majesty, we thought you had left before sunrise." Lucas frowned. "I have not gone anywhere." The mayor blinked twice. "Then how did you return only a few minutes ago from the southern road?" Lucas felt his heartbeat quicken. His boots carried traces of forest soil that did not belong anywhere near the northern border. A small piece of lavender rested against the sleeve of his traveling coat. He slowly closed his eyes, already knowing the answer before his memories returned. Once again, his wolf had crossed half the kingdom simply to spend the night beside Claire's fireplace. This time there had been no palace, no familiar surroundings, and no easy path home, yet nothing had changed the destination. As Lucas looked toward the distant southern horizon glowing beneath the first light of morning, he finally admitted something he had resisted for far too long. Whatever guided his wolf was stronger than habit, stronger than distance, and perhaps even stronger than instinct itself. Lucas Ashford returned to the capital before sunset with a calm expression that concealed a heart filled with questions no royal advisor could answer. Throughout the journey home, he had replayed every strange morning, every blurred memory, and every quiet moment his wolf had spent inside Claire Morgan's cottage. The pattern had become impossible to ignore. His wolf never wandered toward wealth, power, or comfort. It always chose the same small stone cottage, the same warm fireplace, and the same gentle woman who had welcomed a mysterious creature without asking for anything in return. When Lucas reached the palace, preparations for the Harvest Moon Festival had transformed every courtyard into a sea of lanterns and white flowers. Musicians rehearsed beneath colorful banners while servants hurried through the halls carrying baskets filled with fresh fruit and ribbons. Yet even surrounded by celebration, Lucas found his attention drifting toward the western gardens where Claire carefully arranged the final rows of lilies. She moved with the same quiet patience she showed every living thing, pausing to straighten a bent stem before smiling at the bloom, as though encouraging it to stand proudly. Lucas approached slowly, determined to speak with her as himself rather than through the memories of his wolf. Claire looked up, surprised to see him back sooner than expected. "Welcome home, Your Majesty," she said warmly. "I heard the northern villages appreciated your visit." Lucas smiled. "They did, although I suspect I spent less time there than anyone believes." Claire tilted her head with curious amusement, but did not press for an explanation. They walked together along the stone garden path, while the evening breeze carried the fragrance of blooming lavender between them. After a comfortable silence, Lucas quietly asked, "May I ask you something unusual?" Claire nodded. "You may ask anything." Lucas looked toward the distant forest before speaking. "Why did you invite a giant wolf into your home the first night you saw him?" Claire considered the question for a moment before answering with complete honesty. "Because he looked lonely before he looked dangerous." Lucas stopped walking. Her words settled into his heart with unexpected weight. Claire continued with a gentle smile. "Everyone else might have seen sharp teeth or great strength. I noticed tired eyes standing alone in the rain. Sometimes kindness begins with simply noticing what others overlook." Lucas could not find an immediate reply. For the first time, he understood why every memory his wolf treasured felt so peaceful. It had never been searching for a place. It had been searching for someone who looked beyond appearances. That evening, after the palace celebrations quieted and the moon climbed high above the kingdom, Lucas remained awake on the balcony outside his chamber. He made no attempt to lock the doors. He offered no commands to the guards. He simply watched the silver light spread across the forest and whispered with a quiet smile, "Go where your heart wishes." Before dawn, he opened his eyes not inside the palace but within the familiar warmth of Claire's cottage. The giant black wolf slept peacefully beside the bed while Claire had once again chosen the rocking chair rather than disturb her oversized guest. This time Lucas did not hurry away in embarrassment. Instead, he quietly draped an extra blanket over Claire as she slept, gently added another log to the fireplace to keep the room warm, and finally understood that the excuse he had repeated for so many nights no longer felt true. Whatever had led him here was no longer something he could honestly call instinct alone. Morning sunlight slowly filled the cottage, painting soft golden lines across the wooden floor as Claire Morgan opened her eyes and immediately noticed the extra blanket resting gently over her shoulders. She looked toward the fireplace, then toward the bed where the giant black wolf still slept peacefully with one paw hanging over the edge of her quilt. Finally, she noticed Lucas Ashford standing beside the window, quietly watching the first rays of dawn reach the forest. He turned as she stirred awake, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke. The silence felt surprisingly comfortable, as though countless quiet evenings had already taught them how to understand one another without rushing to fill every pause with words. Claire smiled first. "You stayed." Lucas returned the smile with a trace of gentle embarrassment. "For the first time, I decided not to run away before sunrise." Claire stood and wrapped the blanket more securely around her shoulders. "I am glad you did." Lucas glanced toward the sleeping wolf before taking a slow breath. "There is something I should admit." Claire listened patiently. "For days I convinced myself that everything happened because my wolf followed instinct. Every morning I apologized and blamed him instead of asking why he always chose this place." Claire looked at the wolf resting peacefully on her bed and quietly replied, "Perhaps he was trying to tell you something that your mind was not ready to hear." Lucas lowered his eyes with a thoughtful smile. "I believe you are right." They shared breakfast together for the first time, preparing warm oatmeal, fresh berries, and toasted bread while sunlight filled the tiny kitchen. Nothing about the meal felt extraordinary, yet Lucas realized he had never enjoyed such simple peace inside the palace despite its endless luxury. Claire laughed when the wolf eventually stretched, yawned dramatically, and wandered into the kitchen, hoping someone might share an extra piece of toast. "He certainly has excellent timing," she joked as she broke off a small piece of bread and placed it into a wooden bowl beside fresh water. Lucas watched the scene with quiet affection. Every movement felt natural, unforced, and completely free of expectation. Later that afternoon, the Harvest Moon Festival officially began. Visitors from neighboring territories filled the palace grounds while musicians performed cheerful melodies beneath rows of glowing lanterns. Claire spent the afternoon arranging the final floral displays around the central courtyard, unaware that countless guests had paused to admire the beauty of her work. When Lucas arrived to welcome the visiting families, several nobles noticed his attention drifting toward the young gardener among the flowers. One advisor quietly stepped closer and asked, "Your Majesty, shall we invite Lady Eleanor to accompany you during tonight's ceremony, as originally planned?" Lucas remained silent for only a moment before calmly shaking his head. "No, there has been a change of plans." Without another word, he crossed the courtyard toward Claire. She looked up in surprise as the Alpha King stopped beside her arrangement of white lilies. In front of nobles, advisors, guards, and honored guests, Lucas offered her a warm smile that carried none of the uncertainty of previous days. "Claire," he said gently, "would you do me the honor of walking beside me during tonight's festival?" The entire courtyard seemed to grow wonderfully still. Claire looked into his calm silver eyes and saw no hesitation, no excuses, and no attempt to hide behind instinct anymore. She simply saw a man who had finally chosen to stand exactly where his heart had been leading him all along. Claire Morgan looked at the Alpha King for a long moment before placing her hand gently in his. A warm ripple of surprise moved through the gathered guests, yet Lucas Ashford paid no attention to the whispers surrounding them. Together they walked beneath rows of glowing lanterns toward the center of the palace courtyard, where musicians welcomed the beginning of the Harvest Moon Festival. Claire had spent countless seasons arranging flowers for this celebration, but she had never imagined standing among the honored guests instead of quietly working behind them. Lucas noticed the uncertainty in her eyes and offered a reassuring smile. "You belong here," he said softly, "not because I invited you, but because your kindness has already earned this place." Those simple words eased the last of her hesitation. As the evening ceremony began, Lucas stepped before the assembled nobles, village elders, palace staff, and families who had traveled across the kingdom to celebrate together. The courtyard grew silent beneath the silver moon as he addressed his people. "Leadership is often measured by strength," he began calmly. "But I have learned that true strength is revealed by kindness freely given when no reward is expected." Many listeners glanced toward Claire without needing to be told why the Alpha King spoke with such conviction. Lucas continued, "A peaceful kingdom is built not only by those who wear crowns, but also by those whose compassion quietly changes the lives around them every single day." Claire lowered her eyes, deeply moved that he had recognized the quiet work she had never expected anyone to notice. When the ceremony ended, music returned to the palace gardens. Laughter filled the evening air, and children ran between lantern-lit pathways decorated with the flowers Claire had carefully grown throughout the year. For the first time in many seasons, Lucas allowed himself to forget royal schedules and simply enjoy the celebration beside someone who made even ordinary moments feel meaningful. Hours later, after the last guests departed and the palace lights slowly dimmed, Lucas walked Claire home beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars. The forest welcomed them with familiar silence while a cool breeze carried the comforting fragrance of lavender through the trees. When they reached the little stone cottage, Claire opened the door and smiled as the enormous black wolf wandered inside with complete confidence, circled once upon the familiar quilt, and settled happily across the bed as though claiming its favorite sleeping place once again. Lucas laughed, shaking his head with affectionate surrender. "I suppose he has made his decision." Claire smiled back with playful warmth. "I think he made it a long time ago." Lucas looked at the peaceful wolf, then back at Claire. "For weeks I blamed everything on instinct because it was easier than admitting the truth." He took a slow breath before continuing. "My wolf found this place first, but my heart chose to stay because of you." Claire's eyes brightened with quiet happiness as she answered, "Then neither of you has to apologize anymore." Lucas gently squeezed her hand, feeling a peace unlike anything he had ever known inside palace walls. Outside, moonlight settled across the quiet forest exactly as it had on the first rainy evening when a lonely wolf knocked softly upon the door of a small cottage. So much had changed since then, yet the most important truth remained beautifully simple. Kindness had opened a door that power never could, and love had arrived not through grand destiny alone, but through countless small choices to trust, to care, and to come home again. From that night forward, Whenever palace servants smiled at the familiar sight of the Alpha King's wolf wandering toward the little cottage at the edge of the royal forest, Lucas no longer blamed instincts. With an honest smile, he simply admitted that both the wolf and the man had finally found where they truly belonged.